Hi, this is Debbie, and for my Doodling with Debbie feature for Sam Says Stamp this month, I'm taking a look at the new and exclusive Sam Says Stamp Concord 9th STAMPtember collaboration set, Monster Hugs. The Monster Hug set has the most adorable monster with a really expressive face. You can stamp his hand separately to be waving, or to be holding a banner or balloon, and then there are a variety of sentiments to coordinate. I decided I wanted the monster to be holding a balloon because I love the open space a balloon affords for colouring. One word of warning though is that these images are a really good size, so to fit the monster and balloon on an A2 card, you want to start stamping the monster near the base of your panel. I'm not the best at lining up images, just as I'm not the best at stamping sentiment straight either. However, I fix any discrepancies with a waterproof marker such as this Pitt pen from Faber-Castell. I'm using Archer's cold press watercolour card and VersaFine Onyx black ink because I'm going to watercolour this scene. VersaFine is a waterproof ink, and cold pressed card is my favourite due to the texture and way it holds paint. However, due to the texture, I did have to stamp each part of the image at least twice, sometimes more, to get a clear image. VersaFine is a waterproof ink, however you do need to ensure it's dry before starting to paint or it will smudge. I've used 3M painter's tape to add the card to a board, and this will help prevent it warping if I use a lot of water. To watercolour this little guy, I decided I wanted a muted palette, and I pulled out some swatches I'd made using burnt sienna and various blues. The main swatch along the top is burnt sienna mixed in various quantities with ultramarine blue. But lower down, the bottom two rows are burnt sienna with phthalo blue green shade and cerulean blue chromium, and I loved how these blues combined with the brown to form dusky greys, greens and teals. I usually paint from tube paint which has been dried in a palette, but I don't currently have phthalo blue in my setup, and so I added a small dot of each of the colours to a side plate, and this will then act as my mixing plate. And having used this combination, I can see I'm going to have to squeeze in a spot for phthalo blue in my palette moving forward. I added water with a brush and started mixing the three colours together to create a pool of various hues, and I'll be dipping my brush into this puddle of colour throughout the painting. Although I used three colours for my swatch, in actual fact I think I mainly mixed the phthalo blue and the burnt sienna, and the cerulean blue chromium didn't get much of a look in. I've decided that the light source will be coming from the top right, and so my shadows will be on the bottom left. And so I started painting the monster's back and lower legs first with a medium concentration of the paint, and then rinsing my brush to dilute and spread the colour. I'm dipping into different areas of the mixing plate to pick up different hues and dotting those into the wet paint to blend on the surface. I found it best to not make the face of the critters too dark or you lose the expressions, and so my aim is to keep a light layer of paint over the face and then deeper colours around the edges, particularly on that left side. At this point I'm not worrying about creating fur texture at all, but getting down a good base layer of shadows and highlights. The only exception is that when I'm painting close to the lines of the monster's image, I use a flick of the brush to create wispy fur-like edges. I'm also adding a little more depth of colour below the mouth where there might be shadows cast from his overbite, and also on the underside of his arm holding the balloon. Once I'd got a first layer down, then I dried the panel and started on the second layer with the tummy and horns. If I tried to paint these while the first layer was wet, then the colours would have run and mixed together, and I wanted the tummy to stay lighter as his rounded belly would no doubt be catching the light. Once the first layer was dry, I also realised I needed to bring in more depth of colours as they always dry lighter, and so I used more concentrated paint mixture to give deeper, darker shadows. It was at this point that I started to build a little fur texture. I didn't want to add marks over the whole of his body as I thought this would look too busy, but instead by adding a few flicks and marks in places, it would give the impression of fur without it overwhelming the image. I kept dotting around the fur, adding a few marks here and there, and then I dried the panel again, and to add some highlights to the fur I used white gouache. Gouache is an opaque watercolour which allows you to paint over darker colours, and so I added a few flicks of white here and there as well, and then I turned to the ground. Whereas I wanted the monster to be grey with hints of brown and blue, I wanted the ground to be more brown but with still some variation in there and hints of the other colours. For the balloon, I wanted it to be mainly blue, and for this I mixed up phthalo blue with just a touch of burnt sienna for a more dusky blue hue. I then painted the first light layer, leaving an unpainted area for the light catching the balloon, and then brought in more concentrated colour and let the water do the work of blending it all together. I added more burnt sienna into the shadow area of the balloon, which with the light coming from the top right would be the lower left of the balloon closest to the monster. I dried this layer and then added more depth of colour for the second layer, and then I dried that layer and added more colour again. Each time I reduced the area that was painted to concentrate on those shadows. Once I'd painted the balloon though, I now realised that the monster and ground seemed a little wishy-washy in comparison, so I went back in with more concentrated paint mixtures to add depth and balance the colours better. I must admit I love this limited colour palette with knockback muted hues, and I think the overall effect is quite vintage in feel and really suits the expression on this little guy. With the painting finished, I debated whether to add a wash of colour to the background, but instead plumped for some good old splatter. I used some of the same colours and splattered with the blue and brown in a diagonal across the card. I then turned to the Monster Hug stamp set again for the sentiment, and I already knew which one I felt suited this card. With a slightly worried expression, I thought that I'm sorry greeting was perfect, and so I planned on where to stamp that in between the splatter droplets, and used the ruler from Tim Holt's Media Kit to ensure I'd lined it up straight. Once I was happy with the placement, I then stamped the sentiment a few times with VersaFine Onyx black ink to get a good clear impression. To add more fur texture, I took a dark brown Faber-Castell POLYCHROMO pencil and added a few more flicks here and there, and added a few more shadows to the horns also. I then trimmed the panel down to 4 by 5 1/4 in size and added foam adhesive to the back before mounting onto a fog card base. I debated what accents to add, and then I had to answer the door and forgot to turn the video camera back on when I decided that sea breeze and dark walnut nouveau droplets were the way to go. So I've added those to my card. However, when I thought I was filming, I was mentioning a tip about how to get nice round droplets, and that is to tap the back of the card once you've added the droplet, and this causes the liquid to round off into a nice shape. So there you have my feeling blue little monster looking slightly worried as he offers a balloon as an apology. Over on the Sam Says Stamp blog you'll find more inspiration and details about this cute Monster Hugs STAMPtember set from Concord 9th, and I'll have a coordinating blog post over at limeddesign.com if you want to find out more details about this card. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.